Our next speaker is Peter Young. He is a voice for creative and often controversial tactics to achieve animal liberation. From interviews with ALF activists to nearly 20 years in the movement, Peter has observed and reverse engineered the mindset of the militant and reveals the 7 laws that drive them. Please welcome Peter Young.
Okay, thank you. So I guess this is the last talk of the conference. So I feel like obligated just to kind of say one thing. I really want to just give a thanks to the organizers of this conference, because I don't know if they're going to thank themselves at the plenary, closing plenary. So everyone, we should give a round of applause for them. And before you do it, hold on. And yes, them. Okay, let's do it. Organizers. And then, yeah. And then, as well, there's a lot of people behind the scenes who have really, who don't get recognition. The people doing the dishes, my God, the people cooking the food, all the volunteers, that is just thankless work. So we should all give a round of applause for them. Okay. So also just one more thing before I get started. I am extremely humbled to be up here. I don't feel like I deserve it. The people I met in Europe, I mean, best animal rights activists in the world are in Europe, most creative, most effective. And so I don't know if they want me to mention their names, so maybe I won't, but the people I met doing awesome work in Italy and Poland and Lithuania and Finland and England, and you know who you are, and everyone I've met here, it's just amazing. So I'm just very humbled to be here, so thank you all. So, quick story. This was a story that was shared with me many years ago. It was shared with me recently about something that happened many years ago. And it was a story that, like I said, I'll repeat it again. This happened many years ago. So all the police officers in the room can turn off your recording devices. This will not be useful to you in any prosecutions. Quick story. Somebody was aware of an animal research laboratory in their town, and they were aware of some documentation about animal abuse that was held in a specific place inside a specific building at this specific university facility. And so they had no one to work with. They didn't know anybody else. They knew they wanted to do something to expose the cruelty in this laboratory. So they had no skills. They had no friends. They had no in the movement. They really had nothing working to their advantage. One day they were reading a newspaper, and they read a statistic, a little news thing that said that on average, 1 out of 38 times that you leave your house, you accidentally leave the door unlocked. And the person thought, okay, that's interesting. How could I apply that to this particular situation I have at this laboratory? So this person reasoned that it's probably more likely that you would leave a door unlocked at your place of work than your home. So this person went to this particular building, this particular door, one night and jiggled the doorknob, and it was locked, as you would expect, after hours. And this person went back the next day and did the same thing, and they went back the next day. And they reasoned that, statistically speaking, if they went there 38 days in a row, they would find the door unlocked once, based on this statistic that they had read. On the 27th day, that door was unlocked. And what they found inside, well, the rest is history. I won't go into specifics. You'll forgive me for being vague. But what is that? What is that accomplishment? What is that person did? Is that a skill set? It's not a skill. Everyone can jiggle a doorknob. I would argue it's a mindset. That person exploited a loophole and used it to achieve great victories for animals in this situation. And this is a mindset that you can cultivate in yourself. Now, one thing that I feel like I've always noticed is that what makes a great activist is not a set of skills, as I said. It's not what they know. It's not the skills that they have. It's the way they think. And I think we've all seen this. It's the way. What makes a great activist is how you think. And I kind of began this journey of decoding or trying to understand what makes great activists more intensely several years ago when I started a book project where I was compiling stories from really successful activists who had done great things and achieved some great victories and taken some big risks for animals. And I began to compile their stories. Oftentimes these stories were shared with me anonymously. So I'm going to kind of look at the common denominators and try to understand what made these victories happen. How do these people think? And so what I found is I could sort of distill down this mindset into 7 principles or 7 ways of thinking that separates highly effective activists from people that just hang out on Facebook. Now, it's really important for me. I think the name of this talk is like in the brochure. It's like the 7 laws of militance or something. Let's go ahead and rename that right now. I want to make this more accessible. Let's just say like the 7 laws of like a highly achieving activist. As I talk, I am going to give some stories that are sort of slanted towards like the animal liberation front and stories like that. Mostly because I think it's more interesting to just tell those stories. But I really want this talk to be relevant for everybody, and I really tried really hard to make these principles relevant to every activist, even if on the surface it appears I'm just talking about like direct action and like super tough stuff. In reality, it's really important for me this is relevant to everybody, so just keep that in mind. So let's get into it. 7 laws of highly effective activists, 7 laws of action, 7 laws of militants. Number 1. People who are highly effective activists know that nothing is ever as complicated as you think it is. I had another story that was shared with me anonymously about a very similar situation to the story I told in the beginning. Laboratory, person wanted to get inside, had no idea how to do that. They had they had read a lock-picking book once several years ago on how to pick locks. They had a lock pick that they made at home, literally from a bobby pin. Like you've seen that in the movies. I don't know, like you pick a lock with a bobby pin. Like that actually can work sometimes. And then they had a steak knife as the other tool needed to pick the lock. And they had no idea how to pick locks other than this book they had read several years ago. And they found a hidden door at a university just for testing purposes. It was like a broom closet. And they spent 5 days, 6 hours a night with no book, no training, just trying to figure out how to pick the lock until after 6 days, 5 or 6 days, they got it down to where they could pick that lock in like under 5 minutes. And this ultimately, as I said, I'm being intentionally vague with the story, but that ultimately led to some great victories for animals, and some animals were saved. So when I get up and talk sometimes, I feel like you kind of have to have a target audience. And you can't please everybody, and you can't talk to everybody. So I try to think like, who am I speaking to when I do a talk? And maybe this is kind of weird, but I always think I'm going to make my talk for me when I was 18 years old. Like, what did I want to hear from a podium when I was a new activist? So maybe it's kind of weird. That's why I say some kind of weird stuff, because I'm kind of weird, and what I wanted to hear when I was 18 is kind of weird. But I can tell you, when I was 18, all I wanted to hear when I went to a talk was like specific how-to information on how to like break into buildings and save animals. I'm not gonna lie, that's what I wanted to hear. I can't talk about that. I mean, I probably could, but I'd probably get arrested. So I'm not gonna talk about that. But there's one thing that I learned after just many years of being an activist, which is that specific how-to information isn't so important, because when you have a strong enough why, the how will always take care of itself. Do you understand what I mean? When you have a strong enough like purpose, the details about how to accomplish that will always take care of themselves. And so that is a part of this this principle of nothing ever being as complicated as you think it is. When I was I went to prison. I think some people maybe saw my talk yesterday, and I talked about being in prison, and I went to prison for just releasing mink from some fur farms. But when I was in prison, I was surrounded by people, that we call criminals. These are people who, I was in with one guy who used to drill into the roofs of banks and like break into safety deposit boxes. I was in with another guy who actually would rent semi-trucks, like the giant semi-trucks, and back up to Walmart distribution centers and actually just have him and his crew like walk in like they own the place in the middle of the day and just load the semi-trailer up with like expensive electronic equipment, which they would then sell in the black market. Just super kind of gutsy and like creative stuff. And one of the things I learned from being around all these people who did all these crimes for money is that it was actually quite appalling at how, when I was comparing that to the activist movement, how people are willing to take greater risks and do more for a little bit of money than most of us ever will for animals. And that was something that was it put things in perspective for me. So what do you get from that? Like, what can we take from that? Like, the only thing I can take from that is that, they desire money more than we desire animal liberation. And that's not to say that activism, the best activism is always like the sexy, like break in the building, rescue their animals. Like, that's not always necessarily the case. But it's the fact that they took greater risks for a little bit of money than you and I, most of us, ever will for animals. And I thought that was something that was just like a really like sobering lesson to learn being around people like that in prison. When I was very young, this is just falls into the lesson of like never being as complicated as you think it is. When I was 18, or I was maybe 18 or 19, there was a chicken slaughterhouse in Seattle, and I used to look in the window of this place at night. I would go there at night obsessively and look in the window, and I would see chickens that had escaped from that day's like killing session just running loose within the slaughterhouse when I looked through the window. And I would go there night after night and see these chickens. And one day, me and my friends got together, and I just said, we have to do something. And we were 18. I was 18, 19. We had like no skills. We never went to like burglary school or anything like that. We just had a purpose that was very strong. And we went there. I think we maybe had like bolt cutters. Like that was the extent of our like tools. And we just showed up at this place at 1 a.m. and we're like, let's get these chickens. So we like went around the back and like scaled the wall and like kind of almost died, and like one of us fell and we had to get back up and got on this wall and we're on the roof. We're like, all right, what do we do now? And we're kind of walking around. And there's like staircase that went down into the loading dock. We're like, all right, we're getting somewhere. And then there's like a door, and so we like took the bolt cutters and like cut it. Anyway, we ended up getting to the killing floor of the slaughterhouse and getting these 3 chickens out. Now, that is something where I think if you ask the average person, you put them outside the slaughterhouse and said, how would you get in? They would say, I have no idea, and they'd turn around and walk away. But there's something about putting yourself in a situation and just allowing opportunities to present themselves. And that's what we did that night. Next law, number 2, is what I have written here is actually probably not very what I want to say. What I have written here is that nothing happens until you get out of your house and start trespassing. Now, in the interest of making this relevant to everybody, I think it's better put, maybe I should just say nothing happens to you till you get outside your house. This is something I call the proximity effect. Allow me to explain. When I was I was very young and living in Seattle, and I would sit there and obsess endlessly over where the laboratories were in Seattle, the animal research laboratories. Now, this was before the internet, so you can just, at least in the US, you can just look up the address for every single animal research laboratory. Now, back then, this was impossible. We had no idea how to even find out where these places were. So I sat on this like quest to find these labs for a year or more without any progress. Then one day, me and my friends just said, well, we know of this place that breeds rats for labs. Let's just go there and see what happens. And we went there and we just walked around. We had no plan. And we look in the window of a truck and we see a binder on the seat of this truck that says delivery list. Now, we just broke out the window and took the binder. And what we had effectively was a master list of every single laboratory in the state of Washington. This was huge. This information was not public. And that only happened because we put ourselves in a situation with no plan and a clear mind and just allowed opportunities to present themselves. And I can tell you, this is really like the weirdest thing. I'm not like a religious person, obviously, and I'm not like a superstitious person, but there's something I can't explain that I've seen play out time and time and time again, which is if you put yourself physically in a situation where you want something to happen, opportunities will present themselves. It's almost, and it's going to sound really like new agey and like weird and spiritual, but I swear it works. Like it's almost like the universe has this contract with you that if you put yourself there, it will meet you halfway and present an opportunity. It's very interesting. I can't even tell you how many times I've been in a situation where I just go to a place and I'm like, oh, well, there's a ladder that goes up to a window that's open, and like you just see things. It's very interesting. And I don't really mean this to apply just to like, again, I really want to stress this, like just like the illegal, like sexy stuff. I mean this to apply to everything. Like if you want to do a circus protest, but you're not really sure or whatever, you're much more likely to get that protest done if you go to the place where the protest is happening or where the circus is happening, and you just put yourself there and you can envision where the elephants are going to be or where they are. You can see the elephants, or you can see where you're going to stand. You can see a place to, maybe you want to do a lockdown or whatever the case may be. There's something like magical that happens when you just put yourself physically where you want something to happen. So if you want footage of animals in a laboratory, you're almost certain to sit at your house and think, how am I going to get this footage? I have to get a job there, or there's really no way I can get this footage. I can almost promise you, if you just go to the laboratory, an opportunity will present itself. I mean, it's just very strange how this works. I cannot stress it enough. So I don't know if you've ever watched like an old ALF video. I used to watch these Animal Liberation Front videos, and I was always like kind of like annoyed because I always wished the videos would start like just like 2 minutes before when they did. Like it's cool, they're in the building, they're walking around, like they're looking tough and they're saving animals, but I want to know like how did you get in the building? And this is always what I would think, and I would always get like kind of bothered watching these videos. But one thing I've learned since then is that that doesn't so much matter, as I said before, that if you put yourself there, chances are you will find a way in. So do with that what you will. But I have almost never been somewhere that I couldn't get into. I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I've almost never been somewhere I couldn't get into. Now, I'm just speaking about generally like life stuff. Like if there's a concert I want to go to, like when I went to see Bad Religion when I was like 19, I had no money. I found a way in. I always found a way in. You know, whether it's like something activist related or not, you will always find a way in, but you have to put yourself there. It's kind of like the cosmic contract. I've gone places with no plan, and I have like found like blueprints to buildings inside of dumpsters. I've found like unpublished fur farm addresses like taped to doors. I found like, I mean, just crazy stuff, like dozens of unlocked doors just walking around, and like it's just the stuff that you this will not happen unless you put yourself there. So there you go. So that's when ideas become actions, is when you bridge that gap between, you know, where your living room and like where you want something to happen, and there you go. So number 3, and this is kind of a long one. I'm just going to blaze through it. The number 3 law of effective activism is demystifying legal consequences. Now, for the 100th time, I don't mean this to just apply to people who break the law. So that's really important. But I think this comes down to just 3 categories, and I'll go over them each very briefly. The first one is fear of police, interacting with police, which is going to happen to almost any activist at some point. A fear of jail is another one. Whether or not you're doing activism that is overtly against the law. Obviously, none of us are doing that, but it's not so much that, but prison is at least in the back of our minds for most of us. We think it could happen to us. So getting over the fear of jail is huge. And then the likelihood of getting caught for what you do, which is another thing. So I'll just tell you a quick story. When I was a fugitive for a number of years. I was running from the FBI, and I had this like game I would play where I had an ID, an identification card, a driver's license under a fake name. It was a real ID, so I could get stopped by police and they could run the ID and it was fine. So I knew one day I was going to be arrested, and I knew one day the consequences were going to be very severe, or there's going to be a lot at stake for me being in the situation with the police. So I used to play this game where I would sort of bait the police into stopping me while I was a wanted fugitive. Now, I did that because I wanted to numb myself to what it meant to interact with police. Do you understand what I'm saying? I wanted to, when it actually happened, and there was a lot on the line, a lot more than just like a traffic ticket, I wanted to be so comfortable being in the presence of a cop and talking to a cop because I'd done it so many times that it was just like another day, another cop interaction. So when I got arrested, I had like a bail hearing, which is where they decide if you're going to get let out. And they announced, the FBI actually had the lawyer for the FBI had to get up in front of a judge and say, Mr. Young has been in police custody 32 times during the time that he was a wanted fugitive. And I'd actually been stopped by police 32 times during the 8 years that I was wanted by the police, by the FBI. And part of the reason I did that, I shouldn't say it was just to numb myself. I kind of actually would bait the police into stopping me because I knew one day it would come out that I'd been in their like custody 32 times, and it would make them look really stupid, and it would be really funny, and I can get up in here and tell you about it. But also part of it was just, you know, that it's really important to sort of numb myself to that. So anyway, getting over. Have you heard the statistic that the number one fear amongst human beings is a fear of public speaking? It's like more than even death. Have you ever heard this statistic? This is true. Like they poll people, they say the number one fear of people is getting up in front of an audience and speaking. Well, I don't believe that because I can tell you that, you know, most people, if they have to get up in front of an audience and talk, they end up doing just fine. I think the number one fear of people is interacting with police, because almost nobody can keep their mouth shut when they talk to the cops. History has shown us. It's whether or not we think about it, interacting with police is very intimidating to most people. And I think most people who are very effective activists would overcome that fear of interacting with police, because it will be necessary in your work as an activist. The next one, I'm really actually not going to go into this one very much. The fear of prison is something that I think is very important to overcome. And I don't mean to demean the realities of prison, but I think we should have a sober assessment of what prison really is and also what it is not. If I had to put my prison experience in just one sentence, it would be, it was the parts that I thought were going to be bad were not bad, and the parts that were bad were things that I never thought of. So I'll just leave it at that. But I think speaking to people who have been to prison and not just relying on movies or books or whatever, not that any of that stuff is made up, but it's a very distilled down sort of selective account of prison life. So just find someone who's been to prison and talk to them, and also keep in mind that no one prison experience is going to apply to across the board. Everybody, there's a million prisons in a million different states and countries and jurisdictions and so forth. So get a well-rounded account of what prison is and try to understand that most of the time it's not a fate worse than death. Last thing is a sober account of risks. Now, as an activist, I think we like to think that we are there's a likelihood of prison is much greater than it really is. And I actually talked about this a lot yesterday, so I don't want to go too much into it. But just take a sober account of the risks. Everyone in the U.S., people are very scared about this thing called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And it's a real law that has real consequences for real people. And that should not be sort of downplayed in any way. But there was a case where there were 4 people who were indicted under this charge, or this act, who were doing legal protest activity. They weren't ALF activists, they were doing legal protest activity. And that sent shock waves of fear through the entire animal rights movement. Now, I'm sitting back, and my assessment is there are 4 people who got indicted, but there are 9,996 people who protested that same year and did not get indicted. So I'm like a do the math guy. Like I like to sit back and go, okay, so I have like a 0.04% chance of getting indicted under the ATA. That's how I look at things, and I think that's I don't know who's right, but that's a more sober way of looking at things. So we tend to focus on the really negative things and assume that's going to happen to us, and don't really have a more well-rounded statistical perspective on the true risk. So I will leave it at that. So the next thing, I think this is law number 4. Number 4 is 2 things. There are 2 sides of the same coin. This is 2 things that belief systems or beliefs that effective activists have that ineffective activists don't have. It's 2 sides of the same coin. The first side is a sense of urgency, and the other side is something we'll call speed of execution, and I'll explain what that means in a second. A sense of urgency is sort of an elevated level of empathy. I'll tell you a story really quick. This is another story that was shared with me about something that happened many years ago, and this was it was an unreported action that happened where some activists learned that there were some salamanders that were held inside of a specific room at a specific university building, and they learned that these salamanders were going to be dissected on the next day. And as a matter of fact, they had a very narrow window where they could actually get in the building and actually access these salamanders. They were told that the room was actually left unlocked. It's just that nobody knew where it was, so they weren't concerned about anybody going inside. So these activists in plain clothes, no ski masks, no gloves, no planning, reasoned they could probably, because there's so much activity in a university, they could probably just walk into this room, pick up the salamanders, and walk out. And that's exactly what they did. And so they rescued, I think it was like several dozen salamanders. And it was never claimed, it never got publicity, there was never like a communique sent out, it was just something that was done quietly. And that was only done because of this sense of urgency, which is like this elevated level of empathy where you actually see the world through the eyes of the victims, of the animals. Now, this is very difficult to sustain because you'd probably be in prison in like under an hour if you truly viewed the world through the eyes of the animals. because you would be doing things that would just be motivated entirely by like fear or self-preservation. You can't really live this way in the literal sense, but understanding that you should always look at a situation through the eyes of the animals in every possible situation that you can. That is what highly effective activists do. There's a line, live your life as though you were the persecuted. Okay, I think that's what I'm talking about. The other side of that coin is like the unemotional side, which is speed of execution. Effective activists know that the speed with which they actually carry out their actions determines how effective they will be. Now, I would say that easily, I'm going to pull a number out of the air, but 95% of the things that I planned to do that I postponed never happened. And most of the time I postponed them because of some obstacle that was in my head or because I was trying to achieve some perfection in the plan instead of just getting it done. So that came at the cost of, I'm just estimating, like I said, 95% of these plans just ended up not happening. So in like the software world or like the startup business world, they have this term minimum viable product, I think it is, which basically means if you're writing some software. They know that their success in the marketplace depends on how fast they can get it out to the public. So they will rush software out to the market that isn't perfect, and they know it's flawed, but they get it out to the market because you have an advantage when you get it out first. And if you wait for perfection, that day often never comes. So there's a really incredible, and by the way, I don't want this to be confused with haste or introducing unnecessary risks because you're so focused on like getting something done. The fundamentals need to be handled, but after that, you should just focus on doing something instead of doing something perfectly. There's an amazing book. I really encourage everyone to read it. It's called The War of Art, not The Art of War, The War of Art. Different book. And the author talks about something called the resistance. And the resistance is that little voice in your head that talks to you every time you have a big plan with big goals and big consequences for animals or whatever it may be, and the resistance is that thing that tells you, that voice or whatever it is that tells you, like, that tries to talk you out of it. And the author says that's how you know you're onto something good, when there's a voice in your head telling you not to do it. That's like that's like, I don't know, it sounds kind of like weird, but like it's like the universe like testing you. And I've seen this in myself. Like every time I have a great idea, immediately I go towards like, why can't this work? And I think most of us have some variation of that. And by the way, on this idea of like the speed of execution, how many people here have noticed that the more you talk about something, the further away you get from actually doing something about it? Have you seen this phenomenon? It's like there's actually a term for this. I found this it's like psychological journal paper recently. It's called narcotizing dysfunction. Where talking about something on a psychological level gets equated with doing something about it. And so that's like why people in, I don't know, like hardcore bands tend to not be activists. Like they're on stage talking about how tough they are and they don't actually do anything. And I think we all see this, like the big people who talk the loudest are usually the ones that are doing the least. And this is like a very dangerous thing. I started to notice this in myself. Like I have this book I've been working on, and I would always like talk about, I'm working on this book. And consequently, the book, I never made much progress in the book. Well, I started, with the exception of right now, I stopped talking about this book because I knew the more I talked about it, the further away I was going to get from accomplishing it. So be very cautious of this. We used to have this term when I was like doing, I don't know, like ALF stuff many years ago. There were certain people that we called them recon artists. It's sort of a play on words, but like reconnaissance and then like con artists. But these people that would like go out and look at stuff all the time, like, oh, I went and checked out the slaughterhouse or this fur farm, and they were just like so focused on like looking at stuff and like staking it out and doing recon and doing nothing, and they would spend years like staking out their targets, and it was like the more time they spent like researching stuff and hiding in the bushes and like watching the building and taking notes on like security and all that stuff, the further they got from actually doing anything with that information. And so that's the speed of execution. Let's see here. How are we doing? Probably bumping up against. Okay, so right at the 30-minute mark. I'm going to go ahead and say it's easier to get forgiveness than permission and just go over just a little bit. I hope everyone's cool with that. Okay, so next thing, I think it's the second to last one, or no, third to last one. I'll go through it real quick. learn to identify your limiting beliefs. Effective activists understand there are beliefs in your head that hold you back that may not actually be factually correct or objectively true. Here's a great story to exemplify this. I apologize if I'm talking too fast. Everyone from Europe tells me I talk too fast. My house got raided some years ago, and they were claiming to be investigating this raid that happened at a laboratory in Iowa, the state of Iowa. I think it was like 2004. So I think there's like 400 animals that were taken out of this lab. And for whatever reason, we were like 5 states away, and for some reason they thought we might have something to do with this lab raid. It was like a vegan house in Salt Lake City. And after the FBI left, me and my roommate were driving around, just like kind of processing the situation. And my roommate had been an activist for a long time, and he was like, we were looking at the warrant, and we're like, oh, University of Iowa. He's like, it's crazy that that in 2004, this was 2010 when our house got searched, so it was like 6 years after the fact. He was like, it's crazy that these people were able to get inside this lab and get these animals out. Like 400 animals, and like do like $500,000 in damage at this lab. He said it's crazy they could do that in the year 2004. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, that's because everybody knows you can't break into labs anymore. He said it's just impossible. He said after the 80s, when there were tons of labs getting broken into, all the labs locked themselves down, and that it was impossible at that point to break into a lab. And I said, okay, well, let's explore this. Like, how do you know? What is your evidence for this belief? And he's like, oh, come on, man, everybody knows you can't break into labs anymore. And I was like, all right, well, maybe not, but I wouldn't know personally, but let's just explore this. Like, what evidence do you have to support this? And he just kept saying, oh, man, come on, everybody knows that. And so I was like, well, okay, so have you ever actually even been to a laboratory? And he's like, no, but people. And so we did this like circle like 10 times, and I got him to admit that he had no evidence to support this belief. And that's a fantastic example of what you call a limiting belief. And we all have these beliefs that something can't be done. And we might think we have evidence to support the belief, but in reality, the evidence is not always objectively true. And it's a great example. Like, these buildings or these, I'll just use this example, but like a lab wouldn't even have to lock their door if they had us all believing that there's no way you could get inside. You see how that works? Like, beliefs are a lot more limiting to us than like any kind of like surveillance equipment or like police involvement or repression or anything else. It's our beliefs. What's interesting about beliefs is that they can be changed. And you bear with me because this is going to be a little bit kind of like a weird thing I'm going to get into. It's kind of like new agey or whatever, but you can find evidence to support any belief. For example, consider that story I told you. My friend had his, quote, evidence to support the belief that you couldn't get inside a lab after the 80s, and the people that broke into the lab had a different set of beliefs. Now, you can find evidence to support any belief. So, for example, if you wanted to, I'll just use a kind of a weird example, but like let's say, like there's a girl across the room and like you want to talk to her because you think she might be interesting and like worth getting to know or something, maybe here at this conference. Now, if you think of yourself as an unattractive person, like physically, you have a bad personality, whatever the case may be, you think that you're unattractive, you're not likely to go over and talk to that person. Somebody who considers themselves interesting and attractive is probably going to be comfortable going over and talking to that person. Now, for each of those people, I could find 10 or 20 or 100 people that would say that they're unattractive, and I could also find 100 other people that say they were attractive. It's just a matter of where you focus your attention. You can find evidence to support any belief. So, there's very little that's actually objectively true when you kind of think of beliefs like that. It's like my friend saying a lab raid is impossible. The people that carried out that lab raid at Iowa had a different set of beliefs. So who do you think got more done that one night in 2004? The person that believed labs couldn't be broken into, or the people who sought out evidence that labs could be broken into? Obviously, the people that had the second set of beliefs. People who are effective activists choose to believe things that are empowering to them, not things that are disempowering. Next one, and I'm probably just gonna go. So yeah, we'll have like 10 minutes for questions. So I'll just give a few more minutes. This one's real quick. The effective activist, the highly achieving activist, does not give a damn what you think about them. Let me tell you what I mean. I think we all know people who, and even this is true of a lot of activists, before they do anything or say anything, they'll look over their left shoulder at the person next to them, look over at the right shoulder, and then they will decide what they want to say or do. I don't mean that literally, of course. I just mean they survey their social landscape and decide what's going to be fashionable for them to do at any given moment. And on some level, I think we're all affected by this, but there's a lot of people that are a lot worse than others. I heard somebody, a really great quote that somebody said, I don't know the recipe for success, but the recipe for failure is to try to please everyone. People who are highly effective activists, they don't get into like debates on the internet. They don't even care about debates. They're too focused on, taking action. People who are really effective activists, they don't survey the crowd and decide to do what's fashionable. They don't even know what's fashionable. They're too focused on their outcome, right? And the achiever has actually, and this is kind of an elevated level of this, but they've actually delegitimized opinions. Opinions themselves have no merit, no validation. Actions are the only thing that counts. And I think we can all agree with that opinion, because the highly achieving activist knows that your actions are your only true measure as an activist are your actions. It's not how well favored you are by other activists or the public at large. It's what you do and how effective you are for animals. When I was in prison, probably the only cool thing about about the culture of prison is that all that matters in prison is what you do. What you say has no merit. You're either somebody's best friend or you're stabbing them in the throat. Like, there's no in between. It is considered to be extremely looked down upon and actually sort of culturally forbidden to like talk shit or criticize somebody. You're either their best friend or you're punching them in the face. That's it. And what I appreciate about that is that it strips away all the nonsense and just gets down to like the action. You're either doing something or you're shutting up. That's it. There's no in between. And I think that is one of the great things I took. Definitely the only thing cool that I took from prison culture, because a focus on opinions will always come at the expense of your mission. And the highly achieving activist answers obviously to the animals and nobody else. So the last one I will get into, and then I guess we'll have 10 minutes for questions. And this is the biggest one of all. This is one I really could give a whole talk about this subject, and it's hard to put a category on, but it is understanding fear. It's demystifying fear, and it's actually using fear as fuel. I noticed early on in my activism something very strange. When I think we all think of like doing things that might be a little bit risky, and we get a little nervous inside. Obviously, that's natural. Well, one thing I found is that when I was raiding fur farms, for example, I would be extremely nervous in the car driving to the farm. I'd be extremely nervous before we got in the car, in the days before that. I'd be extremely nervous when we parked, and as soon as we got out of the car and it was go time and there was no turning back, the fear vanished. Now, why does that happen? That happens because when you're in the moment where you're taking action, you're focused on your mission, fear is absent. Fear only happens in anticipation of something. It never happens in the moment. And I think if you really thought about that, you would see that play out in your own life. Almost none of the things you have feared in your life, almost none, like 99.999% of things that you feared in your life never, ever happened. How many of us like get in our car and we're driving to work and we think, oh, goddamn, did I lock the door? And we just go over it in our heads over and over. Did I lock the door? Did I not? Did I turn the stove off? Like you have a pain in your leg, and all day you're like, man, is this cancer? I don't know. Like, what is it? Let's say you had to give a speech for school or something. You're like, oh, I'm gonna get up there and everyone's gonna hate me and laugh at me. Never happened. People didn't even notice you were nervous. So almost nothing that we fear ever happens. And so if we look at it in that way, fear is actually like the worst measure of how scary or possibly negative something is. Fear will deceive you. And the fear mechanism, if you look at it like from an evolutionary biological perspective, it's biologically natural to experience fear. Of course, you're getting chased by a tiger and whatever. Fear is meant to be, but here's the thing about fear. It's meant to be very brief, and it's meant to be a servant of intuition. But today, we live in such a fake society, such a fake world. Like, we're so detached from our natural origins that it's very rare for us to experience actual true fear. So do you ever notice how people actually today in this like first world or like civilized society, whatever, we actually invent things to be afraid of? Have you noticed this? We'll actually like go and like watch scary movies because we like long to fear on some level because it is biologically natural. Or we do like things like extreme sports where like you bungee jump and all this like weird stuff. Or I heard a story about somebody who lived in like Los Angeles, and there were like some wildfires that were like literally like 3 hours away, and they got a phone call from their mom that was like, "Oh my God, are you okay? I just want to make sure you're okay." And the guy was like, "Mom, those fires are like, those are 3 hours away, right?" And she's like, "Well, yeah, I know, but I just want to make sure." It's like we invent things to be afraid of, and it's crazy when you notice how often people do this. I kind of talked about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act a minute ago and how it's very like pervasive in the American animal rights movement for people to fear the AETA simply because like they pass out vegan literature or they like wave a sign outside a building or something. Like, this is very, very common. We are inventing things to be afraid of because on some level we like crave that. I heard a story. I had a friend who was in jail, kind of like a remote location, and there was like one like vegan kid in that town that could go visit this friend who was in jail for activist stuff. And so people contacted this vegan guy and were like, "Hey, this guy needs some support. Can you go to the jail and like visit him and like drop some money off and all this stuff?" And this kid said, No, I can't do that." He's like, "I don't want to be put on the list." The list. You hear people in America talk about the list all the time. I would love to see this list. I don't think there's a list. But he was so paranoid or so like fearful of like being put on a list that he wouldn't go 3 blocks to visit this activist in jail. And that's an example of like inventing fear. So the point about fear is that in the modern age, it is working at the wrong times, and what biologically speaking was intended to be a great like preserver has actually become a prison for us in the modern age. They did a study, this is absolutely fascinating, to get back to my first point, of robbery victims, people who had been held up by gunpoint by someone they didn't know and robbed of their money. And they asked them, one of the things that came out of the study was that in the moment that they had a gun in their face, not one person said they experienced fear. They were very focused, they were very present, they were very, they're thinking like, how can I get out of this situation? But fear was actually absent. And I've been in some situations that were things that I thought would be very intimidating in the moment. And afterwards, I thought it was very strange that my heart rate hadn't even increased. My heart rate increased every time I thought about that situation before and after. But in the moment, I was so focused on, like the survival instinct kicks in that there's no fear. So I think that is a fascinating example of what I'm talking about. So the point of all this is that the true remedy for fear is action. If you have something that you're fearful of, anywhere on the spectrum of activism, the remedy for that fear is to actually do it. Because when you're in the moment, fear is absent. And I think the biggest point I could make about fear, and if I could sum up this whole section, it would be in this like 1 or 2 sentences, which is that fear is the feedback you get when you're about to maximize your potential as an activist. And fear is the feedback you get when you're about to maximize your potential as a human being. So don't fear fear. Understand that fear is sending you a signal that you're about to do something awesome. So to end this talk, I will just wrap up and say, in conclusion, just to kind of go over these things, again, like the 7 laws of militance or highly effective activism, whatever you want to call it. Nothing is ever as hard as you think it is. Demystify legal consequences. Get outside where things really happen. Animals don't die in cyberspace. I think we all know that. Destroy your limiting beliefs. Answer to the animals, not the opinions of other human beings. Adopt a sense of urgency and carry out your actions as quickly as you can without unnecessary delay. And demystify fear, or use your fear as fuel. And you should do these things because the only true measure of an activist is your actions. In fact, the only true measure of of your life are your actions, nothing else. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very, very inspiring for me. And I have a practical question. With some activists in Toronto, Geneva, and in Los Angeles, we have an idea like to organize an international day against speciesism. But sometimes there is this voice in our head, like a resistance, like you said. And like we were saying, like maybe it's a too strong goal. We don't know how to organize it, how to make it. But in the same time, we know that it's very important. And we have a lot of ideas like to organize marches in a lot of countries against speciesism, organize sit-ins in front of slaughterhouses so that there is a big debate that can happen in our societies concerning the oppression of non-human animals. And I wanted to know if you have like tools for us to get rid of these limiting beliefs that we have, and do we have like tools to let all these limiting beliefs in the toilets, and we can go?
Yeah, that's great. Well, okay, this is where I really embarrass myself because I read a lot of books that would be considered to be like kind of weird and like actually make me look weird if I were to name the titles. But I read a lot of psychology books. I would really, and this is one of the big mistakes I think activists make, is they sort of read within their own circle. Even if you don't just read like animal rights books, you might only read books from like leftist, like radical, circles or something. I read a lot of psychology books. I read a lot of marketing books. I read a lot of a lot of weird stuff. But anyway, a lot of these books do address this subject of limiting beliefs. I'm going to go way out on a limb here and kind of embarrass myself. I would really encourage you to read the works of Anthony Robbins. Are people aware of Anthony Robbins? In the U.S., he's kind of this like 6'5", like Hulk, like motivational guru, and he's like, crush your limiting beliefs, go out there and do it. And if you actually read his material and don't just get away from like the sound bites, I hope they don't put this on YouTube, Jesus. If you actually read, in America, this guy's like totally laughed at and made fun of, but his material is solid if you read. There's a book called Awaken the Giant Within that I actually read in prison because I kind of got intimidated into reading it by this guy who like every day he'd come to my cell and be like, "You read that fucking book yet?" And so I finally had to read it to avoid a confrontation, and it was one of the best things I ever did. And I think I can talk about. No, I can't talk about that anyway. I went to see Anthony Robbins speak once, and it was just like extremely powerful. So the point is there's a lot of books out there that cover. That are written mostly for like entrepreneurs or stuff, but like if you can get outside your comfort zone and read that kind of stuff, you will find some of the best motivational material to not be written for activists, but to be written for people who are trying to make money, honestly. If you can just kind of get over that and just like read the stuff, it's solid material. It's really helped me a lot. So.
Yeah. Hello. What do you think about the idea that liberation activities actually are wished and sometimes faked by the industry because it makes them look like victims in the eyes of public and media?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if everyone heard that. How do I feel about the possibility that a lot of these ALF actions are actually faked by the industries to generate negative feelings towards activists? There have been a couple of examples where that I believe that's to be the case, but not anything that fit the ALF model. It's situations where like fur farms have been raided, and then the farmer will say that like dogs were killed, like guard dogs have been killed and stuff like that. One thing I can say, and I cannot back this up with like the source material, but I had a lawyer friend tell me that she turned up this statistic that there was, I'm going to get this wrong with the numbers, but something like 60 or 100 or something arsons that had been where they found the letters ALF or ELF spray painted at the scene were actually verified to be insurance fraud. And they were trying to like scapegoat or like really frame the ALF. I think that happens a lot, frankly. And I think a lot more than we hear about. And there's a lot of weird stuff that happens. There was a fur farm in Colorado that got raided, and like the farmer said like 50 guns were stolen from his house. Like that was pretty obviously like insurance fraud. And that farmer's in trouble anyway, so the whole action could have been insurance fraud. So I think it's more profit motivated than anything. But there's some stuff. There was a incident in Santa Cruz where I used to live where a supposedly the home of an animal researcher was set on fire, and it was like right before, what the hell was that bill? Some kind of California bill was about to pass that like cracked down on activists, and it was, I mean, it just seemed like such a staged event. It's like obviously something no activist would do, and came just before this law was passed, and it generated a lot of negative attention towards activists, and it was just, so stuff like that I think does happen. So yeah.
Should that stop us?
No.
That's what I meant.
No. Come on, I want to beat Jake, so can we get one more question, please? Oh, so close.
Sorry.
Okay, all right, I tried. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, Peter.